Right, so in this webcast we're going to focus on the topic USA 1920 to 1973, which is in Paper 1, Section A of the GCSE exam. We're going to specifically look at the 4-mark question focused on analysing interpretations and why they differ. Probably best, if you haven't already done so, to look at the first question in Paper 1, Section A, which is also a 4-mark question, but is focused on how they differ before you go on to look at why they differ. They're very much in a sequence, this particular set of questions, and this is the second question of that sequence, so probably best to look at how first as a webcast before returning back to this one, which is focused on why they differ. So, assuming you've done that, if we then turn to the key features of this particular type of question, you can see at the top there that I've put the focus of the STEM, which is why do they differ, and here you've got a sort of list of key features that you're expected to cover. First of all, 2 short paragraphs, one for each interpretation to explain why they have this particular perspective. Then you should refer to the ascription, that's the information that you've got around the source. When we look at example, that will perhaps become a bit clearer. And then provide details about when, who, and the motives for the interpretation. So with that in mind, and this is probably the key part of this question, think about the time of the writing, think about where they're writing or what they're writing about, perhaps their previous experience, the authors that is, what knowledge they have, what beliefs they are, circumstances that surround their particular piece of writing, access to information that they might have, or in particular what their purpose and audience might be. So what might they be trying to say, or more specifically, who might they be trying to say this to and why? All of these key things are what you might need to cover in terms of actually your points. Now, it's not necessary to refer to all of these things here listed, but certainly you should be thinking about perhaps a couple for each interpretation. Now, unlike the how different one, there is a requirement in this particular question to provide some specific contextual knowledge to help explain your particular view. So when we look at the example answer, you'll see where that's applied, but some sort of specific context. Ensure that comparisons are related to the focus of the question, so think about how it's related to the question itself. And don't focus on what it doesn't say. It's very tempting to assume that there are lots of other things it could have said based on your own knowledge, but actually just focus on what it is they're saying and why they're saying that particular perspective. Now, it's a 4-mark question, so you're only expected to spend 5 minutes on this particular type of question. Don't go beyond that mark. There are higher tariff questions later on, and it's important that you spend your time on that. So those of you that have already looked at the how do they differ question will be familiar with this particular sequence of sources, and you'll recall that I said in this set of questions, for the how differ question you were focusing on the content, that is the information inside the box. This is different with the why do they differ, because now we want to focus on instead the information that you can see actually within the top section. This is the ascription that I referred to earlier. So although we're not going to ignore what's in the content beneath, so we are going to focus a little bit on what was said here in these 2 sources, we are mainly going to focus on the information that you can see in the ascription. Now, if you recall, the 2 interpretations about women in the 1920s, which is the focus of the question, had different views on what it was like. The top one by Doris Fleischmann here was very much towards the idea of a negative interpretation, whereas Fitzgerald was a more positive interpretation. It's probably worth bearing those 2 things in mind because you're asked to really comment on why they have those 2 perspectives. So the openings to both of your answers should just perhaps reflect upon the fact that, for example, Fleischmann has a more negative impression of women in the 1920s in terms of their life, and why do they therefore have that interpretation, or why does she have that interpretation? And Fitzgerald, on the other hand, has a much more positive interpretation. So why does he have that positive interpretation? So the important thing to do then is to look for the clues within the ascription, to think about that. So if we look at interpretation A to start off with, you can see it's a book written by Doris Fleischmann. I've already mentioned her name several times. Published in 1932, so that's quite important. It's not published in the 1920s, it's published a couple of years into the 1930s, and that year itself, you have to think to yourself, why is that year significant? Well, most of you will know that in the 1932 election, it was FDR, Roosevelt, who won the election over Hoover, and so we have a new president offering a new deal. And so might Doris Fleischmann here be trying to perhaps use that opportunity to perhaps put her own agenda forward? Leaving that to one side for a second, there is some more information provided about her. She was writing about what life was like for women in the 1920s. That's good. That's related to the question. But more importantly, she was a famous campaigner for the rights of women. So if she's a campaigner for the rights of women, she clearly is looking to try and promote politically the view that women should have greater equality, perhaps in terms of greater voting equality, greater equality in terms of actually standing for election, perhaps greater equality in terms of social life as well. So that's really important. So if we combine the two sort of parts together, the idea that, for example, she has a rather sort of negative interpretation of the 1920s for women in terms of the fact that it was hard work, they had to make sure that they were looking after the domestic environment whilst also working because there wasn't enough income. You can see then that she's perhaps got an agenda here in the 1930s with this opportunity that Roosevelt might present itself to try and promote to the new political leader the idea that perhaps women should have greater say in terms of the political scene, and perhaps therefore her writing is trying to emphasise how much women did in the 1920s to support both the household but also the economy and the lives of men. So that therefore gives us sort of a context into why she has this particular opinion. Now if we turn our attention then to interpretation B, if you remember, as we put on the left hand side here, that Fitzgerald has a much more positive interpretation of the 1920s for women. And so why might that be the case? Well, first of all, it says there from an article written about flappers. So flappers were a small group of urban liberated women in the 1920s. So it's in no way a sort of like large cross section of society, but that's his focus. So unlike Fleischmann there at the top, he's not looking at perhaps women all in society, but mainly focusing on the sort of the urban liberated women. Published again in the 1930s. It's not very specific as to exactly when, but we know it's in the period of the Depression. So therefore, he's perhaps looking back upon the period as a whole. Next, we're told that Fitzgerald was an American novelist. So a novelist writing perhaps in the Depression, looking back upon the period of the 1920s in the urban environment, might want to perhaps reflect, perhaps somewhat nostalgically, about what life was like. Maybe to entertain, maybe to perhaps ensure that there's some relief from the drudgery of life in the 1930s with everything that was going on. So he was an American novelist who, both in his personal life and his books, showed what it was like to be a rich playboy during the boom. He and his wife, we're told, Zelda, who he called the first American flapper, so he's getting his experiences from his wife really in terms of life for women, became symbols of the jazz age. So they were clearly very well known, and they were perhaps through this work therefore trying to promote how life was, if you like, one big party. So from all of that, we can sort of see why perhaps his perspective is a little bit more positive in the 1920s. First of all, he's probably focusing around purely the urban environment, perhaps even a really small section of the urban environment, namely the upper classes, the wealthy, that were able to enjoy the indulgences that were available to them at that time. And perhaps from the point of view that he's writing in the 1930s, during a time of depression when there wasn't the same sort of level of opportunity, he's perhaps somewhat nostalgically looking back upon the period to provide some light relief, given the fact that he's a novelist, on what the decade before was like. So, having looked at those two sources, and bearing in mind that you should have probably done that first, before you even start writing any of your questions, and just thought about highlighting the key things, we now turn our attention to the actual answer itself. And you can see here we've got the question at the top again: why might the authors of interpretation A and B have a different interpretation about women in the 1920s? And then here's the key part. It says, explain your answer using interpretations A and B and your contextual knowledge. So it's very important that you don't just simply rewrite what's in the ascription, that information above the content, but also place that in context with some brief understanding of what was going on in the 1920s in this particular case. So if we just look at the answer overall, you can see it's sort of broken up into two paragraphs, each paragraph dealing with one of the interpretations. Unlike the how differ question, I would tend to sort of like deal with one interpretation in turn, so it doesn't really matter which order that you focus on, just one interpretation at a time, whereas in the how differ question you sort of mix them into one paragraph for both interpretations, if you like. So if we start off by looking at the first paragraph here, which is going to be focused on interpretation B. So interpretation B offers a positive image of women in the 1920s. So that's the main reference back to the content of the actual source. So do that in the opening sentence to your actual answer. So you remind the examiner that you understand what the interpretation is. Then we're going to focus not on re-describing how they do that, but on focusing on why they do that. So the next sentence should really have this this idea of focusing on why. So this is because is a good way to sort of focus on why, and then returning to the ascription, the information that we looked at earlier. So Fitzgerald was a rich playboy, we've learnt, and would have therefore experienced the urban lifestyle of the Roaring Twenties. So his experiences are shaping his understanding of what it was like. And now, then we go into the actual contextual knowledge to back that up. You'll notice here that we've got, with the growth of the cinema, including films such as Clara Bow, he would have probably associated this period with one of liberation. So a quick reference to one of the major film stars, a female from the period, and therefore trying to link his idea of the 1920s being an opportunity for women to that. Again, linking it back to the idea of also the ascription. His wife was one of the first flappers that was around, and looking back from the depression of the 1930s, and there's that contextual knowledge again, he may have glamorized the impression of the period. So you can see it's not a lot of contextual knowledge that you need to provide, it's just a bit of understanding as to why he might have that particular interpretation. So having done that, and you can see I've sort of provided two little bits of information, and I think that's probably the best way to approach it. You move on to the second interpretation. Now again, same sort of focus, you can see here in contrast, so we're referencing the idea of the fact that they're different, the two interpretations of life in the 1920s for women, but interpretation A offers a negative impression of life for women in the 1920s. So again, just as we did with that first paragraph, just reminding the examiner of the overall impression given in the source. And then we return to, again, the ascription. It is from D. Fleischmann, a campaigner for women's rights in the 1930s who focused on life in the countryside. So there again, we've got this idea of the ascription sort of being referenced, and as you would then expect, just as we did in the first paragraph, you refer to some contextual knowledge. Here, life was hard as farm incomes dropped due to mechanisation. This meant they could not access the new goods on offer, and women had to take on work as well as completing domestic chores. So just reminding the examiner of why, therefore, life in the countryside was perhaps a little harsher, and therefore explaining why Fleischmann has got that particular interpretation. This is something that Fleischmann probably wants to highlight to the incoming president. So again, referencing the fact that she is perhaps got an agenda here, and providing the contextual knowledge, i.e. President Roosevelt has just come into office, or is going to be voted into office in 1932, in the hope that he might promote greater equality for women. So again, you've got the idea of sort of two bits of information focused on why they have that interpretation, and then 2 bits of contextual knowledge. Not a huge amount, just some contextual knowledge to develop the point. Remember, this question here is only 4 marks, 5 minutes, so they are only expecting a brief sort of contextualisation of what is being said and why, in particular, they are having this view. So, having looked at the sort of specifics of a model answer for that, just a quick reminder of what you've got to do for this particular type of question. So the STEM will always be sort of why do they differ, and it's a 4-mark question, so you shouldn't be spending more than, as I've got there at the bottom, 5 minutes on this particular type of question. 2 short paragraphs, 1 for each interpretation to explain the reason for their perspective, making sure that you refer to the ascription, providing details about when, who, and the motives for the interpretation, for a sort of more detailed outline of what to include. Look at the second slide that I went through earlier. Try to provide some specific context to explain that view. You've seen from the model answer that that doesn't necessarily need to be a long-winded explanation of what was going on in the 1920s, but it should be something specific to contextualise why they've got this particular view. And then try to make sure that you are focusing on the question itself, so life for women in the 1920s with the example we looked at. And then don't focus on what it doesn't say. Don't think about actually what the interpretation is not showing you, but show you why it has this particular interpretation in particular. So that rounds up then the second of the sequence of 3 source questions in paper 1 section A. The last of the sequence is the 8-mark question, which is focused on how convincing. That's a little bit more involved given the fact that it's double the marks, so perhaps tune into the webcast focused on that next.